place as a bargaining
Order,
tactic.
Senator Urquhart. It being 2 p.m, we'll move to questions without notice. I'm going to ask for Senator Keneally will be having the first question remotely, so I'll ask for quiet. Senator Keneally.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Health, Senator Colbeck. In an article in this week's Sydney Morning Herald entitled "New South Wales Pharmacists Stuck in Waiting Game for Vaccines," Mario Baroni, a pharmacist in Western Sydney's hotspot suburb of Fairfield, reported that despite placing a second order for AstraZeneca doses on Monday, the vaccines won't arrive for nearly 3 weeks. He says, and I quote, "These vaccines are in a fridge somewhere, but they aren't in pharmacy fridges." Given there have been tragically 5 more deaths from COVID-19 recorded in New South Wales today, why are pharmacists in the hotspot of Fairfield waiting almost 3 weeks for AstraZeneca vaccines to arrive?
Minister representing the Minister for Health, remotely, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as pharmacies undertake their onboarding process for delivery of vaccines through the National Vaccination Program, there is a process of onboarding, registration and ordering of vaccines, Mr. President. There is a cycle of assessment of that process, of preparing the pharmacists to ensure that the appropriate training has been undertaken so that the vaccines are handled appropriately and administered as they should be, Mr. President. And we have seen in the past the circumstances where, unfortunately, appropriate training, and that's led to mistakes. So there are processes, Mr. President, where as a part of the onboarding process, the pharmacists are registered, they go through a process of assessment and training, and while that process is being undertaken, their orders are taken from them and deliveries are processed, Mr. President. So it does take a couple of weeks to onboard a pharmacist into the system, but that's done deliberately so that we can ensure that the vaccination process is undertaken safely and in accordance with the appropriate processes of delivery of the vaccine to the Australian community.
Senator Keneally, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Port Macquarie-based pharmacist Judy Plunkett says she's yet to receive a single vaccine dose and has said, and I quote, "If pharmacies were brought on in April, we could have done tens of thousands of doses by now. Every barrier has been put in front of us." Why are pharmacists who want to vaccinate Australians against COVID-19 having every barrier put in front of them?
Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I completely reject the premise of Senator Keneally's question. It's always been part of our national plan to progressively increase the number of outlets that the coronavirus vaccines were available at. We started with the state clinics, the Commonwealth vaccination clinics, then we brought on GPs, and as vaccine availability increased, the plan was always to progressively bring on pharmacy, and that's exactly what we've done, Mr. President. Mr. President, I reject the comment that we've put barriers in front of pharmacy. We have progressively built the vaccine supply and the number of outlets to ensure that Australians could get access to a vaccine wherever they are around the country, but to ensure that that is done safely, progressively, so that we can meet our objective of providing everyone who wants a vaccine one by the end of the year.
Order. Senator Keneally, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Pharmacy Guild of Australia's New South Wales branch has criticised the Morrison government's decision to contract logistics out separately, instead of using the community service obligation wholesaler network, which would have used existing cold chain supplies to ensure 24-hour delivery. Does the Morrison government take responsibility for the failed logistics arrangements which are delaying vital COVID vaccines to New South Wales?
Senator Colbeck.
Well, again, Mr. President, I don't accept the premise that Senator Keneally has placed on in her question. Mr. President, all throughout this process, we've put in place systems and measures to ensure the safe delivery and distribution of the coronavirus vaccines. They have to be managed in a particular way. They have to be managed in accordance with appropriate cold storage, Mr. President, and so it has been an unprecedented logistical exercise to ensure the distribution of the vaccine, Mr. President. And we have, across the country, successfully delivered vaccines to thousands of individual outlets for the coronavirus vaccine, Mr. President, and we will continue to ensure that we safely and properly get those deliveries out to all of the outlets that require.
Senator Dean Smith.
Very much, Mr. President. My question is to the Minister representing Indigenous Australians, Senator Ruston. Can the Minister advise the Senate how the Commonwealth's Closing the Gap implementation plan announced today will lead to better outcomes for Indigenous Australians across Australia?
The Minister representing the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thanks Senator Smith for his question on this very important topic. Firstly, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also would like to acknowledge Senators McCarthy, Dodson, Lambie and Thorpe in this place. The release today of the Commonwealth Closing the Gap plan is a really significant milestone in achieving the targets of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, which came into effect last year. With the release of the plan, we are committing more than $1 billion in new measures to support the achievement of Closing the Gap measures. And we're turning our commitments made under the National Agreement into practical and real actions. This plan is about real reconciliation, how we get there, and making sure all governments are held to account, state and federal. So whether it be delivering new health clinics and housing for health professionals to close the gap in relation to life expectancy, or initiatives to lift participation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in quality and culturally appropriate early childhood education and care services, or whether it's delivering the Territory's Stolen Generation Redress Scheme, which supports healing for Stolen Generation survivors. And we will deliver the Outcomes and Evidence Fund to incentivise evidence-based service delivery and deliver tangible and improved outcomes to support child and family safety. We are providing an additional $254.4 million towards infrastructure and better support Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations so they can continue to do the critical work that they do and have been doing so very successfully over recent years. And we're investing $160 million in new funding to ensure the best start in life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children through a range of different initiatives. But most importantly, we're doing this together. This plan is co-designed and it will be co-designed, delivered.
Senator Smith, a supplementary question.
Thank you. Can the Minister explain for the Senate why working in partnership is important to closing the gap and how this is different to previous approaches?
Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As part of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, we set out 4 priority reforms to fundamentally change how governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people work together. The implementation plan that was announced today details how governments will do our part in achieving these reforms. It highlights the real and practical actions to be taken across all areas of government, and most importantly, it commits funding to actions that will ensure that we get there. Importantly, all governments will work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders with an increasing level of accountability, transparency and responsibility. This reflects the new model of working together. We'll prioritise investments so that we are all responding to the evidence and doing things that will make the most difference. The Morrison government is committed to working with Indigenous Australians to deliver the outcomes needed to close the gap.
Senator Smith, the final supplementary question.
Thank you very much. What are the benefits of this new approach under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap?
Senator Ruston.
Under the new National Agreement, we've committed to work in true partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. Like the Commonwealth, all parties are required to develop implementation plans that outline how they will deliver their parts and their commitments under the national agreement. They are required to report on their actions annually, ensuring there is a much greater level of shared accountability than under previous agreements. Increased transparency is built on data, and the Morrison government has already delivered towards this priority reform this year with the release of the Closing the Gap dashboard, and we will continue to deliver on our commitments. The implementation plan is also firmly in line with our continued commitment to work in genuine partnership with Indigenous Australians in both policy development, program and service delivery. This commitment to shared decision-making will be embedded in the design, implementation and monitoring of policies and programs to improve life outcomes for all Indigenous Australians.
Senator Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. In section 1.1 of the Morrison's fourth vaccine plan released in just 2 months, the Morrison government lists everyone it blames for the slow COVID-19 vaccine rollout, including ATAGI, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, state and territory governments, vaccination clinics and Australians themselves. How did the Morrison government forget to list itself?
The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, what a petty question from Senator Gallagher, and what a misrepresentation of the documents and the facts. Mr President, the government acknowledges that there have been challenges in relation to the vaccine rollout. We acknowledge that, and we take responsibility for it and for fixing it, Mr President. And we take responsibility for ensuring that, notwithstanding the challenges that have been had in terms of supply that was forecast to arrive that didn't arrive, notwithstanding changes to health advice, we continue to push on with ensuring that we have supply growth now and into the future, that we have growth in distribution points now and into the future. And in doing that, Mr President, we're in the best position to be able to see continued growth in relation to the vaccine rollout. And the data for the last 24 hours is just out, and some 221,859 Australians turned out in the last 24 hours to receive their latest vaccine doses. That, Mr President, is yet another daily record set in relation to the vaccine rollout. And I thank each and every one of those Australians who, notwithstanding the negativity or elsewhere, are turning out in record numbers. It has pushed the total number of doses administered across Australia to more than 13 million now, Mr President. In doing so, it sees the over 70s pass the 80% threshold. That first age cohort who were prioritised under the vaccine rollout, we now have more than 80% of them have managed to achieve the target, and in doing so we will no doubt see even more push on, even more, of course, getting their second dose as those rates climb and that number grow even further in that age cohort, as it will right across the Australian population.
Senator Gallagher, a supplementary question.
Mr President, the reason the initial vaccine rollout has been bungled is the Morrison government's failure to secure adequate supplies. Does Mr Morrison take responsibility for his failure to keep Australians safe?
Senator Birmingham.
Well, Mr President, the Morrison government procured some 195 million doses before we get to the recent announcements, in relation to those booster doses that were procured. Now, Mr President, the government, absolutely, as I said before, accepts responsibility for the rollout, the challenges and fixing it. That's our job as a government. We don't shirk or shy away from doing so. We are pleased to see that we have increased volume of supply. We're pleased to see that we have increased distribution points able to be brought on progressively as we get that increase in supply. We are particularly pleased to see the way in which Australians are responding in record numbers to the vaccine rollout. Australians responding in ways that don't mean they need $300 payments. They're making it clear they want the vaccine. They're making it clear they want to turn out. And we are supporting them to make sure they have increasing chances to turn out, rather than the types of silly policy thought bubbles from those opposite.
Birmingham, time for the answers expired. Senator Gallagher, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. In June, Mr Morrison boasted nobody in Australia had died from COVID-19 in 2021 and nobody was in intensive care. Mr Hunt boasted it was one of the most extraordinary public health achievements in Australian history. 21 people have tragically died in the New South Wales outbreak and 51 people are now in intensive care. Does Mr Morrison concede he is actually responsible for one of the most extraordinary public health failures?
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. No, we don't make that concession. We acknowledge that managing COVID-19, managing a global pandemic, remains incredibly challenging, that Australia has done far better than the rest of the world in the management of the pandemic. But tragically, 932 Australians have lost their lives from COVID-19, 932 in total. 21 have lost their lives during this New South Wales outbreak. Mr President, our government is determined, though, that Australia will continue to do the best we can in managing the pandemic according to the medical advice that we have. That's why we commissioned the Doherty Institute to undertake the modelling there. It's why we have made sure that we progress and advance a plan built upon that advice and evidence. Australia is not immune from COVID-19, but we are absolutely able, as we've done, to continue to respond to the changing circumstances of the Delta variant, to other challenges thrown at us, but to do so in world-leading ways.
Senator Birmingham. Senator Whish-Wilson.
President, my question is to Senator Hume, representing the Environment Minister. Minister, Australia has just successfully lobbied a UNESCO World Heritage Committee to vote against the scientific advice provided by the IUCN that the Great Barrier Reef should be listed as in danger. A report from Spanish media overnight quoted Spain's UNESCO ambassador as admitting to striking a deal with Australia, that they would support Australia's amendments to have the reef not listed as in danger if Australia backed its attempt to have 2 Spanish properties added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, despite the committee recommending against this. We have also heard that Australia co-sponsored an amendment to list a site in Saudi Arabia, despite the committee also recommending against this. Minister, can you confirm these reports and detail what other deals were done in the name of your government's political agenda?
The Minister representing the Minister for the Environment, Senator Hume.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and I thank Senator Whish-Wilson for his question, his enduring care of the Great Barrier Reef, which is shared with that of the Morrison government. The Morrison government, in fact, is deeply committed to protecting the World Heritage Great Barrier Reef. The tourism industry, traditional owners, the reef communities, they rely on the Morrison government's commitment to the reef, and we will not let them down. Our world's best management of the reef is acknowledged by many, including the World Heritage Committee, who said in this year's decision on the reef that it commends the state party, that being Australia, for the strong and continued efforts to create conditions for the implementation of the Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan.
Whish-Wilson on a point of order. Senator Whish-Wilson on a point of order.
Point of order on relevance, President. Did the government do any deals to win the UNESCO vote?
Senator Whish-Wilson, the question had a very lengthy preamble, I appreciate. The Minister was addressing the body that made the decision you were questioning about, so I believe the Minister is being directly relevant if she's talking about the decision that was made, because she's entitled to be directly relevant to all or part of a question, especially when it is lengthy. Senator Hume.
Thank you very much, Mr President. So discussions between the members of the committee will always remain private, so we make no apologies for defending. We make no apologies for defending Australia's reputation as the best marine park managers in the world. Mr President, the Minister for the Environment has highlighted before that climate change is the most serious long-term threat to the health of coral reefs worldwide, and that includes the Great Barrier Reef. It also threatens 82 other World Heritage sites around the world. Rainforests, fjordlands, glaciers, none would be better off if UNESCO succeeded in its bid to single out Australia for what is, we all agree, a global problem. And that's why the World Heritage Committee unanimously struck out this year's attempt to use Australia only for its global call to action. Mr President, with only 1.3% of global emissions, Australia cannot fix this problem alone. The world must do more to reduce emissions, and the World Heritage Committee must find a path towards collective action and not singular punishment. The Morrison government's concern was that UNESCO sought an immediate in-danger listing without appropriate consultation and without a site visit and without all the latest information. It's clear that this process has concerned not only Australia but other nations as well. So we welcome the support of an overwhelming majority of the nations at the 44th session of the World Heritage Committee.
Senator Whish-Wilson, a supplementary question.
Minister, UNESCO didn't strike this out. It recommitted the vote to May 2022. Your government is now being watched closely by the world. There is specific language in the recent UNESCO ruling that requires Australia to demonstrate an acceleration on key points of the REEF 2050 plans, including by lowering emissions that are killing the reef beyond current plans. What is your plan for accelerating emissions reduction, and how is giving money to new fossil fuel projects, including the gas-led recovery, going to accelerate emissions reductions?
Order. Senator. Order. Senator Hume.
Thank you, Mr President. Indeed, 19 of the 21 members of the World Heritage Committee spoke in support of Australia's position. The World Heritage Committee's endorsement of Australia's position will give reef managers, marine scientists and land managers the chance to demonstrate the success of the outstanding work that is taking place across the reef. We will invite representatives of UNESCO and the IUCN to visit the reef and see firsthand the work that we are doing to build the reef's resilience and submit a State Party report to the World Heritage Centre by the 1st of February 2022.
Order.
We will continue to work with UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee to protect the long-term future of the reef. And we're working with the Queensland Government to ensure that the strategies under the REEF 2050 plan are delivering the best possible outcomes for the reef. The Australian and Queensland governments are investing more than $3 billion from 2014-15 to 23-24 to implement the REEF 2050 plan, and more than $2 billion of this is from the Australian government.
Senator Hume. Senator Whish-Wilson, a final supplementary question.
Minister, the world's best science provided by the IUCN to UNESCO tells us we all face a future where one of the world's most iconic and critical natural wonders may die in our lifetimes, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels and a lack of ambition, global ambition, on climate change. Minister, can you today put your hand on your heart in the Senate and say you are happy with what your government is doing, everything possible to reduce emissions and protect the barrier reef for future generations?
Senator Hume.
Senator Whish-Wilson, thank you very much for your question. Thank you, Mr President. Hand on heart, Australia is a good citizen in the World Heritage System, and we have implemented all previous recommendations. But what on earth corrective measure could we possibly implement on our own to address global warming? We are delivering on all of our outcomes that we have committed to in the REEF 2050 plan. That includes controlling outbreaks of the crown of flawn starfish that eats coral, improving water quality, doubling the on-ground joint field management program, addressing plastic pollution, rehabilitating island, coastal and reef habitats, and in fact, as reported in the 2019 Reef Water Quality Report Card, we are over halfway to the fine sediment target and almost halfway to the dissolved inorganic nitrogen target. Mr President, can I reiterate that the Morrison government is deeply committed to protecting the World Heritage-listed Great Barrier Reef?
Order. Senator Hume. Order. I'm going to ask senators, the wearing of masks makes it particularly difficult to call senators to order because I can't see their mouths move. I can recognise some voices at the front of the chamber, but particularly at the rear of the chamber. Senator McDonald.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Health and Aged Care, Senator Colbeck. Can the Minister advise the Senate on the latest health measures to support closing the gap?
The Minister representing the Minister for Health, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr President. Thanks, Senator McDonald, for the opportunity to outline these important measures. And I know that Senator McDonald takes a strong interest in closing the gap, particularly working with local communities in Far North Queensland. Mr President, to support the first Closing the Gap implementation plan, the Morrison government is investing more than $300 million in health infrastructure and programs to ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders can access health services when and where they need them. The government is also investing $45 million to ensure the best start in life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children through the Healthy Mums and Healthy Bubs program. This funding is an additional $82 million for the Connected Beginnings program, which includes funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health services. These programs are focused on promoting healthy outcomes and healthy lifestyle choices for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their babies. This will provide mothers with improved access to health care, including access to antenatal care from their health providers, and to provide support until their baby is 1 year old. These programs complement and build on the government's investment of more than $781.1 million in the 21-22 budget to prioritise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and ageing outcomes. Mr. President, the Closing the Gap implementation plan sets a foundation for the Commonwealth's efforts over the next decade in achieving the targets in the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, signed by all Australian governments in July of 2020.
Senator McDonald, a supplementary question.
How is the Liberal and Nationals government supporting Indigenous Australians as part of the response to COVID-19?
Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, thanks Senator McDonald for the question. Through the Commonwealth Government's $1 billion investment in new Closing the Gap measures, we're investing $254.4 million in infrastructure to better support the critical work of Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, which have been a significant part of the government's response to COVID-19. Operated by communities delivering comprehensive and culturally appropriate primary healthcare services, including administering COVID-19 vaccines across rural and remote Australia. Mr. President, we are absolutely committed to improving health services for Indigenous Australians, their families and their communities. Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations have been vital in providing health support for Aboriginal communities across Australia.
Senator McDonald, a final supplementary question.
What are the socio-economic targets related to the National Agreement on Closing the Gap?
Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. The new National Agreement on Closing the Gap was released in July last year and represents a significant shift in the Closing the Gap framework. 17 national socio-economic targets will track progress in improving life outcomes, including closing the gap in life expectancy within a generation by 2031, increasing the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies with a healthy birth weight to 91% by 2031, and significant and sustained reduction in suicide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people towards zero. Mr. President, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan is underpinning action to drive progress against these targets with a combined national focus. The Closing the Gap implementation plan has been developed by ministers, departments and agencies across our nation, with peak Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partners, particularly the Coalition of Peaks, representing around 50 community-controlled organisations.
Time has expired. Senator Siewert, remotely.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Health and Aged Care, Senator Colbeck. If children between the age of 12 to 16 are not included in the government's vaccination targets, the whole of the population target is actually 65%, not 80%. If we reopen at 65%, our hospitals will be overwhelmed and we will have tens of thousands of cases. As Queensland's latest outbreak shows, kids can catch and transmit COVID. Why aren't you including children above the age of 12 in the vaccination program? How many children have to catch COVID before the government includes them in its vaccination targets?
The Minister representing the Minister for Health, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks, Senator Siewert, for the program. Mr. President, children are in fact included, as announced by the Health Minister on Monday, in the vaccination program. We commenced with children with certain health issues, Indigenous children and children in remote communities, as a part of our vaccination program. The vaccination availability and approval for children was only made by the TGA in recent times, Mr. President. And so the Health Minister, in fact, did announce on Monday that children will become part of the vaccination program in the categories that I've outlined, Mr. President. Our objective is to offer all Australians for whom a vaccine has been approved the opportunity to have one as soon as possible. We want all of those over the age of 18 to be able to have the opportunity for a vaccine by the end of the year. And as I've said a number of times, and as the Health Minister and the Prime Minister and many of my colleagues have said, we'll continue to grow and develop the vaccine program with the availability of vaccine, opening up more opportunities for Australians to access the vaccine through more outlets. Mr. President, it's important that as many Australians as possible get vaccinated. We've seen with the Delta variant how the COVID virus has modified and changed its behaviour, and so it's important that we continue to adapt to the circumstances as the virus itself adapts and creates more variants. So we'll continue, and the government will continue to do that, Mr. President.
Senator Siewert, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Minister, the government is not including all children in the targets. They are not including, in fact, children over the age of, or between the age of 12 and 16 in their targets. Why isn't that occurring? Why have you only relied on the Doherty Institute for advice and not listened to other experts as well, such as the Grattan Institute and other experts that are saying children need to be included in the targets, not just the program, and all children between the age of 12 and 16?
Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Mr. President, and again, thanks, Senator Siewert, for the question. Mr. President, the government commissioned the Doherty Institute to conduct research to provide us with advice on the parameters for opening up the economy. We have released that information publicly so that all Australians can understand the circumstances under which the various stages of the process to open up the economy and open up the community can be undertaken. The Doherty Institute modelling was based on the advice with respect to vaccinations available at the time. And Mr. President, and as I've just indicated, children will progressively become part of the vaccination rollout program. But the vaccination program rollout has always been based on a range of priorities, and those priorities have progressed as we've had availability of additional vaccines.
Senator Siewert, a final supplementary question.
Thank you. Minister, are you not including kids because there is not enough vaccine available? And do you concede that by not including children between the age of 12 and 16 in the targets, that this is a much more risky approach?
Senator Colbeck.
Mr. President, thanks, Senator Siewert, for the question. I've already indicated on a number of occasions that children will be part of the vaccine rollout. So I don't concede what she's indicated as part of her question. Children will be, and they already are being included as part of the vaccine rollout, Mr. President.
They're not part of the targets.
Order.
Point of order,
Senator
Chair. Mr. President.
I'm sorry, Senator Siewert. I think the rules of engagement under remote participation don't allow points of order to be made remotely. Someone here can do it, but Senator Colbeck to continue.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Order. Senator Colbeck to continue.
President. Thank you, Mr. President. The government commissioned the Doherty Institute to undertake research to give us and all of the community an indication of the parameters that might permit the community to open up and the economy to open up. That information has been provided to all Australians so that they can understand the circumstances and the targets with which that might occur. Mr. President, we will continue to work to provide access to vaccines for all Australians as approved
Order.
by the
Senator
TGA.
Colbeck, time has expired. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. I refer to the answer the Minister for Urban Infrastructure gave in the House yesterday about the Commuter Car Park Fund. Yesterday, the Minister claimed decisions were based on departmental advice, yet the Auditor-General found that not one of the 47 car parks were recommended by the department. Today, Mr Morrison refused on 9 occasions to say what involvement he had in deciding the car parks in target seats. At any point, did Mr Morrison or his office see the list of top 20 marginal seats used to distribute funds?
The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Colbeck. Senator Birmingham. I apologise.
Thanks, Mr. President. Mr. President, these are valuable projects for communities around Australia that the senator is asking questions about. They do and will provide benefit to people in a range of different communities. As is well known, they were subject of an ANO report, and the department's accepted the recommendations of that report and has begun to implement them.
Have you concluded your answer, Senator Birmingham? Order. Order. Senator Brown, a supplementary question. Order. Senator Brown is on her feet. Order. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr President. Evidence on the public record makes clear the Prime Minister's office was directly involved in deciding grants under the Community Sport Infrastructure Grants Program, revising projects on the infamous colour-coded spreadsheet. Can the Minister outline the role the Prime Minister's office played funding car parks for political gain?
Senator Birmingham.
Well, thanks, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's not unusual for ministers, prime ministers, to be lobbied, to be engaged in relation to needs in different communities across the country. And Mr. President, I listen to those opposite, who, of course, once again, they have their own version of history. They fail to acknowledge the fact that Labor had its own $300 million park and ride fund, don't they?
Order. Senator Wong on a point of order.
Point of order, direct relevance. The question goes to, and the Prime Minister was asked 9 times, did not answer. This minister did not answer. And we are asking in this chamber what role the Prime Minister or his office played in funding these car parks.
On the point of order, the minister was in order until I think he strayed upon an alternative on alternative programs, because I believe to be directly relevant. One needs to be relevant to the multiple programs that were mentioned in the question. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr. President. Well, the question goes to rank hypocrisy too, in terms of the approach of those opposite. The Prime Minister certainly played no greater role than I suspect the member for Maribyrnong did in announcing 24 such projects.
Senator Brown, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Today,
Senator
Mr Morrison claimed Australians had voted for his commuter car park fund, despite the majority of grants being approved before the election was called. This minister echoed those views recently on Insiders. Does this minister really expect Australians to accept the Morrison government using taxpayer money as Liberal Party money on the basis that rorts are okay if you're re-elected?
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr. President. Well, it seems it's okay for those on that side to throw mud about something this side of politics does in relation to funding community infrastructure, and they'll call that names. But when they were doing exactly the same thing in the lead-up to the last election, when they were doing exactly the same thing, of course, it was valuable community infrastructure. It was okay for the member for Maribyrnong to run around the country announcing car parks in different locations, but it's not okay for the coalition to do it.
Resume your seat. Before you raise a point of order, Senator Wong, you would have heard me constantly call order. I couldn't hear a word that was being said. Well, you may have better hearing than I have. I couldn't hear a word as I was calling senators to order.
Mr. President, I understand the sensitivity this minister has in defending this, but he has now on 3 occasions avoided answering a question and resorted simply to going about the—
All right, Senator Wong, there was, I don't. A critique of the content of an answer and whether someone asserts it is an answer or otherwise is not a matter for here. That goes to the content of an answer. Points of order are for direct relevance. I genuinely could not hear a word of Senator Birmingham's quite loud voice as I was constantly calling senators to order. So, Senator Birmingham, to continue.
Thanks, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm happy to come into this place and answer serious questions, well-intentioned questions. I'll deal with the fact that when questions come, of course, from people who hold a consistency in relation to their position. On this matter, I just find it so hypocritical, so amazing that those opposite—
Order. Senator Wong, on a point of order.
Point of order, direct relevance. This question goes to the expenditure of public monies. It is not directly relevant within the standing orders for him to simply talk about the Labor Party.
Well, I'm not at this. I take that point, Senator Wong, and I ruled that point earlier. But as I've made previously too, a glancing comment as you rose to following the minister when the minister made a comment about the opposition at that point, while answering a question about his own comments that contains politically charged phrases in the question, I think an answer of that nature is not out of order. I have consistently ruled very tightly when questions are tight, factual questions, as I did earlier this week. This was not one of those, and the minister is entitled to defend his own record and statements in a manner he sees fit when they're contained in the question. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am simply pointing out the double standard. The Coalition announced policy and commitments in relation to investing in community infrastructure in car parks. The Labor Party announced pre-election policy to invest in car parks.
Senator Birmingham,
Each of them would have been funded by the—
Time for the answer has expired. Senator McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is to the magnificent Minister for Regionalisation, Regional Communications and Regional Education. Can the minister advise the Senate on the specific regional education measures that will lift outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children to support—
Okay. Senator Scarr, on a point of order, which is not common during a question.
Point of order, Mr. President. There was a clear interjection from the Leader of the Opposition in relation to— Sorry?
Order.
Sorry?
We could be here for quite a few weeks in a row. I'm going to ask senators in the first week to take a breath.
So the Leader of the Opposition referred to my good friend Senator Mackenzie as the rorting minister. I think the Leader of the Opposition should withdraw.
First, I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it, so I can't rule. What I'm going to do, that is not in the list of terms that I have traditionally ruled out of order. I will, although if the opposition could listen to me, I am going to seek some advice from the clerk about words that we've asked to withdraw before, and I will come back to the chamber if necessary and upon reviewing the Hansard. But I will ask senators to restrain themselves. I am not certain whether that term has been ruled unparliamentary before, but I will check. I will also urge senators that— can I ask senators to listen for a minute? Terms that are parliamentary when used in a general sense are sometimes unparliamentary when specifically directed at a person. That is what I will check about this term. Thank you, Senator Scarr. Senator McMahon, can you continue your question, please? Can you restart your question, please, because I couldn't hear it?
Yes, Mr. President. Can the minister advise the Senate on the specific regional education measures that will lift outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children to support closing the gap?
The Minister for Regionalisation, Senator Mackenzie.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank Senator McMahon for her question and for her strong representation of the Northern Territory. The Liberal and Nationals government knows that further effort is required to improve educational outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in regional and remote Australia. Indigenous kids, particularly those from remote areas, are more likely to start school behind, with the gap growing throughout their schooling life. And if you start behind, it's incredibly hard to catch up. School attendance rates have not improved, and despite some improvements in literacy and numeracy, about 1 in 4 Indigenous students in Years 5, 7 and 9 remain below the national minimum standards in reading. We want to turn that around. Since the national agreement was signed, the Commonwealth has taken concrete, practical steps to establish partnerships with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people to develop solutions that work and enable shared decision-making processes. Everything we do under that agreement is in partnership, not just with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but with states and territories. As announced by the PM today, we're investing $250 million to ensure all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have a strong and positive start to their learning journey, to be able to access quality education that will assist closing the gap. Significant investment in evidence-based programs are lifting participation and improving literacy rates. $280 million to support improvements in leadership capability, professional development and student outcomes through city-to-country partnerships, getting high-performing metro schools, partnering with Indigenous schools. Haileybury, in my home state, is partnering with an Indigenous school in Darwin, and they're getting great improved increases, because you can't beat what you can't see. And often for young people, it's learning from their peers. And that's seen a significant improvement in NAPLAN results as a result of that partnership. We're also investing in—
Senator McMahon, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Minister, and that is fantastic news for the Northern Territory. Can you tell me how will the Liberal and National government's new measures support effective learning and education outcomes through the development of strong literacy skills?
Senator Mackenzie.
We know that focusing on reading and literacy will help set up Indigenous students for the success in school years and beyond. We're backing what works by providing up to $25 million to scale up evidence-based programs that have already succeeded. We're putting $8 million to support the growth of the program called Making Up Lost Time in Literacy. We're going to double the amount of schools that are going to be participating in that program. That is a program that focuses on a phonics-based approach to literacy skills, because not everybody learns the same way. The government knows how important it is that teachers who are engaged in schools with Indigenous students have the right skills, and will provide $5 million to the Good to Great Schools in Australia program that supports better student learning outcomes by improving teaching methods. And we're also going to provide additional funding to support the expansion of the Kimberley Schools project in the Pilbara region of WA.
Senator McMahon, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Can you tell me how will the government assist students in remote communities to access a quality secondary education?
Senator Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mr President. Well, we're not just investing in early childhood care and education, not just in schools, but for secondary. We're wanting to make sure that parents and students have choice to determine what works best for them. In remote communities, there can be few, if any, local secondary school options, and that's why often boarding or residential schools are an important option for so many children in your home territory, Senator. The government will invest $75 million to help meet the cost of building 3 new boarding schools in remote Western Australia and the NT, and upgrades to a 4th in the Northern Territory. Indigenous children in regional and remote areas need to see the opportunities available to them. Together, using the evidence, we can close the gap on Indigenous education outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students.
Senator Watt.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. Yesterday, the Minister refused to say whether Mr Morrison agrees with Coalition Senator Rennick's use of social media to undermine a TGA-approved COVID vaccine, which his own government is encouraging Australians to take up. Does Mr Morrison agree with Senator Rennick? Yes or no? And if not, what action will he take?
The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Mr President, I can't say that I've reviewed the specific comments of Senator Rennick, and I won't always take Senator Watt's word for it. What I can confirm, Mr President, well and truly, is the government's very strong support for the vaccination rollout and very strong encouragement for all Australians to to get vaccinated at the earliest opportunities, for all Australians to heed the advice in relation to the safety of vaccines and the efficacy of vaccines. The evidence that shows very clearly that both vaccines available in Australia, the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, each of them reduce the rate of death when somebody acquires COVID-19 by some 92% and 90% respectively. That is the prime abiding reason and incentive why anyone should get a vaccine. The #1 incentive to get vaccinated in Australia, because it could save your life, because it could save the lives of your family members.
I have Senator Watt on a point of order. Senator Watt.
On relevance, the question is simply whether Mr Morrison agrees with Senator Rennick.
I think Senator Birmingham did address his familiarity or otherwise with that when he commenced the question, and I'm reluctant to rule out this material as not directly relevant, given that he started with that point. Senator Birmingham. Senator Rennick.
Mr President, obviously it was the fact I was talking about the real incentives to get a vaccine that perhaps drew the point of order from Senator Watt. The real incentives to get a vaccine being the fact it will save your life, save the lives of your family members, save the lives of your fellow Australians. And you know what? Australians know that's the real reason to get a vaccine. They know that the real reason to get a vaccine is because of those life-saving properties. It's why Australians participate overwhelmingly in childhood vaccination programs. It's why Australians are turning out in record numbers to participate in this vaccination program. It's why demand is very strong, and that's why the Labor Party policy in relation to handing out $6 billion of cash is so horribly misplaced,
Senator Birmingham,
Mr. President.
Senator Wong on a point of order. Senator Wong.
Mr. President, the point of order is direct relevance. It is the case that there was reference to what Senator Rennick was doing, but the question goes to whether the Prime Minister agrees, and if not, what action he will take.
Order. Senator Rennick, please. And so on the point of order, I believe Senator Birmingham addressed at the commencement of the answer his lack of intimate familiarity with the comments referred to by Senator Watt, alleged comments referred to by Senator Watt in his question. I will say, however, that while I made it clear I was reluctant to rule material about the vaccine rollout generally as being not directly relevant, I will say that I do not think commenting on opposition policies meets the direct relevant test. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr. President. Now, there was no direct quote in the question, so as I said at the outset, I've not seen whatever the comments that Senator Watt is referring to are. But I'm very clear, the Prime Minister is very clear, the government is very clear in our continuous advocacy around the science, the efficacy and the encouragement of Australians to get vaccinated, as they are doing in record numbers.
For the answers expired. Senator Watt, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. According to his social media, yesterday, Coalition member for Dawson, Mr George Christensen, told the Coalition Party Room, and I quote, "We should not be mandating the wearing of masks and we should not be condoning lockdowns." Does Mr Morrison agree with Mr Christensen? And if Mr Morrison won't take action against Senator Rennick, will he take action against Mr Christensen?
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, the Prime Minister's already said he doesn't agree. He's already said publicly he doesn't agree. He's made that perfectly plain, Mr President. Now, Mr President, I know that Senator Watt thinks there's some ability to run around with a muzzle or a gag or something to address these sorts of comments. In the end, we are, and you're the one who wants to keep highlighting these matters. We want to make sure what we highlight is firmly, squarely the health advice, Mr President. That is precisely what we're doing. It's what we're doing in the communications campaigns this government pursues. Now, the member for Dawson's not seeking re-election at the next election. He'll say what he's saying. The government speaks very clearly from the Prime Minister, from the Health Minister, from all the ministers of the government, from the officials of the Chief Medical Officer and otherwise, to very clearly encourage Australians to get vaccinated. And they're doing so in record numbers, Mr President. 42.4% of all Australians over the age of 16 have now had their first dose. Another record day, and we are going to keep providing them with the information and encourage them to keep.
Senator Watt, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Coalition Senator Matt Canavan has criticised public health measures as, and I quote, "doing much more damage to our love of liberty and our political system. That's the real threat to us now." Does Mr Morrison agree with Mr Canavan? And importantly, what action will Mr Morrison take to ensure that his MPs back in the government's own public health message?
Senator Birmingham.
Well, thanks, Mr. President. And no, and indeed, in a debate only earlier today in this chamber, I responded to Senator Canavan, acknowledging that we did not agree in relation to some of those statements. So we have been very clear in that regard, Mr.
Senator
President.
Watt.
I mean, Senator Watt wants to ask about whether or not people agree. I'd love to know whether they all agree with Mr Albanese's policy. Because it didn't go to shadow cabinet, apparently, so apparently they didn't get a chance to say in their senior levels, in their executive levels, whether they agree. I can assure you, Mr. President, every member of the cabinet of this government agrees
Senator
with our
Gallagher.
approach.
Order.
Mr. President, he's
Order. I've got Senator Gallagher on her feet with a point of order. On my right, Senator Wong.
Mr. President,
I can't see on my right who's interjecting, but please cease. Senator Rennick, I can see you. Senator Gallagher.
point of order, Mr. President, on direct relevance. The minister is ignoring the guidance you've provided and previous rulings on commenting on opposition policy.
I think by the time you had raised, the minister had moved on from that glancing phrase, but I take the point, and I think the minister has taken the point. He sounded like he had moved on. Senator Birmingham.
Indeed, Mr. President, as I was saying, to finish the sentence I was in, every cabinet minister in our government stands very clearly for the policies of getting this rollout delivered. Our policies are consulted through the cabinet. They go through the cabinet and we stand by them. And the fact is that the vaccine rollout is seeing high and growing demand across Australia. That high demand and growing demand is something that we will continue to encourage. Australians are responding to that message, and we thank—
Order. Senator O'Sullivan. Senator Rennick. Senator O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business, Senator Cash. Can the Minister advise the Senate how the Liberal and Nationals government is supporting Indigenous Australians to upskill and gain employment opportunities to support closing the gap?
Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business, Senator Cash.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Senator O'Sullivan for the question. And can I just acknowledge Senator O'Sullivan's previous role in working with the Minderoo Foundation in particular, but his dedication to ensuring that Indigenous people were given every opportunity to get a job. Senator O'Sullivan clearly understands the benefits of upskilling, of reskilling, to ensure that people are equipped with what they need, those necessary skills to move into employment. Mr. President, today's release of the Closing the Gap implementation plan, it was well and truly an important moment for our nation, but it also shows the important work that all partners of this historic agreement are doing to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. In the 2021-22 budget, the Morrison government delivered funding for substantial reforms to help Indigenous Australians get into quality and long-lasting jobs both now and into the future. That is why we're delivering a $243.6 million new Indigenous skills and jobs advancement package. This is all about improving the economic, the social and the educational outcomes for Indigenous Australians. What this investment, Mr. President, includes is around $42.8 million per annum. This will then grow to $60 million per annum in future years to the Indigenous Advancement Strategy for a new skills and employment program. Mr. President, the program will build on the most successful elements of the current Indigenous-specific employment programs and focus, so importantly, on upskilling Indigenous Australians for in-demand jobs. We want them to get into work, but also putting in place those mechanisms to support them into
Senator
employment.
O'Sullivan, a supplementary question.
Mr. President, I thank the Minister for that answer. Can I also ask, how is the government investing in pilot programs to help Indigenous Australians looking for work?
Senator Cash.
Again, and I thank Senator O'Sullivan for the question. And Mr. President, we know that continue to closing the gap, and obviously we're all committed to closing the gap, but also to empowering Indigenous Australians. We need to work together. with all sectors of the community, with all levels of government, to improve opportunities. In the 2021 budget, again the Morrison government committed to investing in pilot programs to ensure that employment services aligned with the changing job market, and in particular, as we know, COVID-19 has impacted on that job market, but in particular the changing job market in remote Australia, in order to meet the unique needs of job seekers in remote communities. The new pilots will commence in a number of locations by the end of 2021, following, so importantly, a co-design process. Then we will progressively roll out the program in 2020.
Senator O'Sullivan, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. How is the government investing into Indigenous Australian-run businesses, particularly in primary industry, to grow and prosper?
Senator Cash.
Thank you, Mr President. And again, as part of our plan, and in particular to assist us in securing Australia's recovery, but also to continue to meet the Closing the Gap employment targets, we are prioritising funding from the Indigenous Advancement Strategy to support economic growth, but also to ensure that we are providing jobs on country. Through the 2021-22 budget, we're delivering $10 million over the next 2 years to support Indigenous businesses and community organisations involved in the primary industry and land management sector to grow, to prosper and to create more jobs, in particular for Indigenous Australians. By supporting Indigenous businesses, we are working together to improve employment, economic development and social participation. Again, Mr President, we know that to continue to closing the gap, to continue to empower Indigenous Australians, we need to work together with all sectors of government.
Senator Cash. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Mr President, I ask that further questions be placed on notice.
I'm going to